If you're listening to this, you may drift off before the end. So before you do, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Before we start, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, close your eyes. Just relax, take a deep breath, and let everything go. Good night. Now we can begin. The rain had not stopped since dusk, a thin, whispering drizzle that veiled the streets in a silver sheen. The air was thick with the scent of wet pavement, cold stone, and something faint but unsettling, like old wood left to rot beneath floorboards. I had been walking for hours, following a road that seemed unfamiliar despite having lived in this town my whole life. Buildings leaned into the fog, their windows dark, their doors shut tight. I should have turned back, but ahead, just at the bend where the streetlights flickered, I saw it. A door standing alone in an alley that had never been there before. It wasn't attached to a building, just a door, freestanding, weathered with peeling black paint. It looked old, impossibly old, but the handle gleamed as though polished daily. I stopped, my breath misting in the cold air, and checked my watch. 3 o'clock, not a second before. Not a second after. A strange unease crawled through me. The door felt expectant, as if waiting for something, or someone. I stepped closer, my footsteps muffled by the damp air. The street behind me was silent, too silent, as though the world itself held its breath. I reached out, fingers brushing the handle, and a chill ran through me, deeper than the night air. A whisper, barely audible, coiled through the alley like a gust of wind slipping between cracks. I didn't move. The whisper wasn't coming from behind the door. It was inside my head. Then, with the slow groan of shifting wood, the door creaked open. No hinges, no push, just an invitation. A deep, suffocating darkness spread beyond the frame, vast and endless. I should have run. I should have turned back. But something in that shadowed threshold pulled at me, a quiet insistence that I was expected. I crossed the threshold, and the door closed behind me without a sound. The darkness swallowed me whole, thick and absolute. I braced myself for the feeling of walls or cold stone beneath my fingertips, but there was nothing. No floor, no ceiling, no sense of space. Only the sensation of standing, though I could not tell on what. My breath sounded too loud, the air oddly still, as if the world had paused. Then a faint glow appeared ahead, distant, flickering, like a candle struggling to stay lit. I walked toward it, each step weightless, as though I was drifting instead of moving. The glow strengthened, revealing the outline of a corridor. The walls were rough, textured like uneven rock, but when I reached out, my fingers met the smooth surface of wood. The scent of old paper and candle wax thickened the air, familiar yet out of place. The corridor stretched forward, impossibly long, and I could not see where it ended. The flickering light ahead remained just out of reach, drawing me forward with slow, deliberate insistence. The whispering began again, no louder than the hush of distant waves. This time, it did not coil in my mind, but echoed through the corridor itself, brushing against the edges of my hearing. A voice, or perhaps many voices, layered over each other in a murmur too faint to understand. I slowed my steps, feeling the weight of unseen eyes pressing against my back. The whispers did not come closer, but they did not fade either. They lingered, following me like shadows cast by a fire I could not see. Then, without warning, the corridor ended. A single door stood before me, identical to the one I had stepped through earlier. Black paint peeling at the edges, a polished brass handle untouched by time. I hesitated, fingers hovering just above the surface. The whispering fell silent. The air grew impossibly still, as if the space itself was waiting. I turned the handle, and the door opened without resistance. Beyond it, a vast moonlit room stretched before me, filled with old wooden furniture, books stacked in uneven towers, and a fireplace that crackled, though no fire had been lit. The ceiling arched high, disappearing into shadows, and in the very center of the room stood a chair, simple, unadorned, facing away from me. Someone was sitting in it, The fire in the hearth crackled, though there were no logs to feed it. The room smelled of wax and dust, the scent of time settling into forgotten places. I did not move at first, my breath shallow, my pulse slow. The chair in the center of the room remained still, but the weight of presence was undeniable. Someone, or something, was seated there, facing away from me, their posture unnervingly rigid. I took a step forward, my footsteps soundless against the old wooden floor. The moment I moved, the flames dimmed, shrinking into embers that pulsed like dying stars. Shadows stretched long across the room, and though I could not see the figure's face, I felt their attention shift, as if they had known I was here all along. The chair creaked, just slightly. I wanted to speak, but the silence was too thick, pressing against my throat like unseen hands. Instead, I waited. A slow, deliberate moment passed before the figure raised one hand. Pale fingers curled slightly in an almost beckoning motion, but they did not turn around. Something in the gesture unsettled me. It was too careful, too practiced, as if it had been repeated many times before. The door behind me was gone. The walls, though lined with bookshelves, had no windows. There was no way out except forward. I took another step, and this time the air shifted. A low hum, more felt than heard, vibrated through the room. The fire dimmed further, shadows stretching like ink spilled in water. The whispering from before returned, not from the walls, not from the empty corners, but from the figure in the chair. I could not make out the words, only the steady rhythm of syllables spoken too softly to grasp. It was not a greeting, not a question, not even a warning. It was something else entirely, something I was not meant to understand. The figure's hand lowered, resting again on the arm of the chair, and though they had not moved otherwise, I felt the distinct and undeniable sensation that they were smiling. The fire flickered, the air grew colder, and then, finally, the figure spoke. "It opens again at 3. The words sent a shiver through my spine, not from fear, but from the certainty that they were true. The voice lingered in the air long after the words had been spoken, as if the sound itself did not want to fade. It was not an old voice, nor a young one. It carried no accent, no emotion, just the certainty of something that had always been. The fire in the hearth shrank to a dull glow, and the room felt colder, the shadows more aware of my presence. I swallowed, my throat dry. The figure in the chair had not moved since they spoke, their posture frozen, their heads still turned away. But something was different now. The weight in the room had shifted. The walls, the air, the silence itself, they were all waiting. I took another step forward. The whispering did not return this time, but the wooden floor beneath my feet groaned, the sound impossibly deep, as if the house itself was stirring from sleep. The scent of dust thickened, mixing with something faintly metallic, something I could not name. I reached out not for the figure, but for the space between us, testing whether the silence would break. It did. The figure stood, not abruptly, not with force, just a slow, deliberate motion that sent a ripple through the air, like the turning of a page in a book no one had touched in years. They did not turn around, but their presence was heavier now, more defined. The chair scraped softly against the wooden floor as they stepped forward. One step, then another. My pulse hammered against my ribs, though I did not know why. Then they stopped. A breath passed between us, then another. And then, without sound, without hesitation, they raised their hand once more, pointing past me, towards something I could not see. The room had no doors, no windows, only endless shelves and the fire that had nearly burned itself out. But I turned anyway, compelled by something deeper than curiosity, something older than fear. The wall behind me had changed. Where there had been bookshelves moments ago, there was now a door, black paint peeling at the edges, a brass handle that gleamed as though it had been polished only moments before. It had not been there before, but it had always been waiting. The figure behind me spoke again, their voice closer now, though I had not heard them move. "It only opens at 3. I did not need to check the time. I already knew what it would say. I did not turn back to face the figure. I couldn't. Something in the way they stood, the way their voice carried through the dim room, made it clear that I was not meant to look at them. Not yet. Instead, my gaze remained fixed on the door that had not been there moments ago, yet now felt like it had always belonged. The brass handle gleamed, waiting. The wood, black and aged, carried no markings, no signs of what lay beyond. The fire in the hearth gave one last flicker before extinguishing completely, plunging the room into cold, silent darkness. My breath came slower now, steady but uncertain, as I reached forward. My fingers brushed the handle. The air around me thickened, the room pressing inward as if holding its breath. A sensation ran through me, something between static and memory, the faintest trace of something I had forgotten but never lost. I turned the handle. The door swung open without a sound. Beyond it, a hallway stretched forward, impossibly long, lined with doors on either side. Each one identical black wood, brass handles, and an unsettling stillness. The hallway was dimly lit, though I could not see the source of the light. It pulsed gently, as though breathing, casting long shadows that stretched and curled like they were alive. I stepped through. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the door behind me shut, a quiet finality. No click, no slam, just the certainty that it had closed and would not open again. The hallway was silent. No whispering, no distant echoes, just the soft hum of an unseen presence, watching, waiting. I hesitated before moving forward, my steps careful, measured. The first door on my left seemed to shift slightly, though I had not touched it. I exhaled slowly and reached for the handle. The moment I did, the entire hallway changed. The doors blurred, stretching and warping as if reality itself had been twisted by unseen hands. The walls expanded and contracted, and in that instant I knew. I had been here before, not in this exact place, not in this exact way, but I had walked this path, touched these doors, breathed this air, and though I could not remember when, I knew what came next. Behind the door, something waited, something that knew me. The door beneath my fingertips felt warm, as if someone had just touched it from the other side. The sensation unsettled me. Not scalding, not burning, just alive. I hesitated. The hallway behind me was unchanged now, still lined with identical doors, still stretching into an impossible distance. But the moment before, I had seen it shift, felt it twist. I wasn't imagining it. I gripped the brass handle and turned it. The door opened inward, revealing a room unlike the one I had just left. It was a bedroom, small, familiar. The scent of old wood and dust mixed with something softer linen left too long in closed drawers. The walls were pale, the floor covered in an intricate, faded rug. Against the far wall stood a wooden bed with an iron frame, the kind I remembered from childhood. The blankets were neatly folded, untouched. A single window, curtainless, allowed dim light to filter through, though I could not see what lay beyond. The sky outside was a muted gray, featureless, like a painted backdrop. I stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath my weight. There was nothing unnatural about the room, no whispers, no shifting shadows, just an eerie stillness, the kind that settles in places left undisturbed for too long. And yet I felt watched. I turned, expecting to see someone, but the doorway was empty. The hallway was gone. In its place stood a blank wall. I was trapped. A slow realization crept over me. I knew this room. Not just in the way one recognizes an old photograph, but in the way one remembers a place they have woken up in before. I had been here, slept here, dreamed here, and then I saw it, the nights, and beside the bed, a small wooden clock sat atop it, the hands unmoving, frozen at an exact time. 3 o'clock. My breath caught. The whispering returned not outside the room, not behind me, but inside my own mind, threading through my thoughts like something long, buried waking up. The air felt thick, charged with something unseen, and as I reached for the clock, the shadows in the corners of the room deepened. The moment my fingers touched the cold glass, the clock's hands began to move, slowly at first, then faster, spinning in impossible loops. And from behind me, where no one had been before, a voice spoke, soft, familiar, as though it had been waiting for me to return. The voice sent a shiver through me, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it wasn't. It wasn't a voice I could name, nor one I could place, yet it carried the weight of something long, forgotten like a lullaby half remembered or a whispered secret from childhood. I turned, the room had not changed, the bed remained untouched, the window still framed the same gray, endless sky. But there, just beside the door that no longer existed, stood a figure, not a shadow, not an outline. A person, still, silent, watching. They were dressed in something old, something I couldn't quite describe. Their features were neither sharp nor blurred, as if they were caught between existing and fading. But the most unsettling part was their stance. They did not move, did not breathe, did not shift in the slightest. They simply stood, waiting, their hands clasped in front of them. "You were never supposed to leave," they repeated, the words carrying no accusation, only certainty. I swallowed hard, my fingers still resting against the frozen clock. The hands had stopped spinning now, but they did not return to their original place. Instead, they had settled at 3:15. The moment I noticed it, the figure moved, not with a step, not with a turn, one blink and they were closer. I tensed. My pulse pounded in my ears. The air between us felt thinner, stretched tight like fabric about to tear. "What is this place?" I asked, though my voice felt smaller than it should. The figure did not answer. Instead, they lifted one hand and pointed toward the wall where the door had been. The moment they did, something shifted. The wall rippled, like water disturbed by a single touch, and then, slowly, impossibly, the door returned. But this time it was not black, it was white. The brass handle was still the same, gleaming, waiting. But the door itself, it did not feel like the others. It did not belong the way they had. I turned back to the figure, but they were gone. The space where they had stood was empty, as if they had never been there at all. The clock on the nightstand ticked once. A single, sharp sound that echoed far too loudly in the silent room, and then the whispering returned. Not a voice, not a warning, a countdown. The whispering coiled around me, soft but insistent, slipping through the silence like wind through an open window. I couldn't make out the words, not fully, but I understood their weight. A countdown, a reminder, a warning. The white door stood before me, unfamiliar in a way that made my chest tighten. Every other door had been black, aged, as if they had always been part of the house. But this one looked untouched, new, almost deliberate, as though it had been placed here for me specifically. I hesitated, the clock on the nightstand ticked again. Another sharp, singular sound that sent a ripple through the air. I reached for the handle. The moment my fingers touched the brass, the whispering ceased, the air stilled. The pressure in the room shifted, like a held breath waiting to be released. I turned the handle. The door swung open, revealing a narrow corridor. It was different from the hallway before. This one was smaller, enclosed, lined with dimly flickering lights that buzzed softly overhead. The floor was smooth, stretching forward into an uncertain distance. I stepped through, my movements careful, my breath slow. The door closed behind me with a quiet click. I did not turn back. I knew it would be gone. The corridor stretched forward, impossibly long, bending slightly as if curving in on itself. The further I walked, the more the lights above flickered, their buzzing growing louder, almost rhythmic. A pattern, a pulse. I wasn't alone. I could feel it just out of sight, just beyond the edges of my vision. Something moved within the flickering light, shifting each time the bulbs dimmed, a shape, a presence. Watching, waiting, I kept walking. My footsteps were the only sound, aside from the growing hum of the lights. But then, as I reached a bend in the corridor, something changed. A shadow stretched along the wall ahead of me. Not my own, tall, still, waiting. I stopped. The lights above flickered again, slower this time, and in that moment of darkness I knew. Whatever cast that shadow was closer now. I exhaled, steadying myself. The air felt heavier, colder, and then, just ahead, a door appeared, black wood. Brass handle, the same as before. I took a slow step forward, knowing that once I touched it, something would change. Behind me, the whispering returned. This time, I understood the words, "It's almost 3 o'clock." The whispering clung to the air, curling around me like breath in the cold. The words were clear now, deliberate. "It's almost 3 o'clock." The black door loomed ahead, identical to the others. A door that had appeared only when I needed it. Though need was the wrong word. It had not come to save me. It had come because it was time. I reached for the handle. The brass was warm under my fingers, pulsing faintly, as if something on the other side had been waiting for my touch. I turned it, the door swung open. Beyond it lay something unexpected. A street, empty, silent. The air was thick with the scent of rain, though the pavement was dry. The sky above was deep gray, stretched too wide, too still. Streetlights lined the road, but their bulbs held no light, only the memory of illumination. The buildings stood tall and unmarked, their windows dark, their doors shut. I stepped forward, and the door behind me closed. There was no wind, no distant hum of a city at rest, only silence, and yet I was not alone. Something was here, watching, moving just beyond my sight. I walked down the empty street, my footsteps the only sound. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, no turns, no intersections, just an infinite path, lined with doors that did not belong to any place I recognized. And then a noise, not loud, not sudden, just a quiet, rhythmic tapping. A sound that should have been lost in the vast emptiness, yet pressed against my ears like a whisper against my skin. I followed it. The tapping led me to another door. This one stood alone, unconnected to any building. Just a door, freestanding in the middle of the road. Black wood, brass handle, it was open. Beyond it, a room waited. A single chair, a dim light overhead, and the shape of someone seated, unmoving, their head tilted just slightly toward the doorway. The tapping stopped. I exhaled slowly. Then, as if pulled forward by something unseen, I stepped inside. The door closed behind me, and the figure in the chair spoke. "You've been here before." The voice was neither welcoming nor hostile. It was a statement, spoken with the quiet certainty of someone who knew more than they were willing to say. "You've been here before." I remained by the door, the air in the room thick and still. The figure in the chair had not moved. Their posture was relaxed, too relaxed, like they had been waiting for me a very long time. A dim, overhead light cast their features in soft shadow, but I could make out the sharp angles of their face, the way their hands rested lightly on the arms of the chair. "I don't remember," I said. The figure tilted their head slightly. "You wouldn't." The door behind me had vanished again. I expected that by now. I took a slow step forward. The room was empty except for the chair, the light, and the person seated before me. The walls were smooth, unmarked, and the air smelled faintly of something metallic like old keys, like time left too long in the dark. The figure finally moved, not much, just enough. Their fingers tapped once against the chair's wooden armrest. A small sound, yet it echoed like something far away. "You should sit," they said. I didn't. Instead, I glanced at the walls, searching for something, anything that might explain where I was. But the room gave me nothing. No windows, no markings, only the light above, and the person in the chair watching me with quiet patience. "You were closer last time," they murmured. I frowned. Closer to what? The figure didn't answer. They simply lifted one hand and gestured toward the floor. I looked down. For a moment, I wasn't sure what I was seeing. The floor beneath me wasn't solid. It wasn't quite liquid either. It was shifting, slow, steady, like the surface of deep, undisturbed water. But there was something underneath. A reflection, not mine. I saw movement, shadows twisting below the surface, shapes half formed, watching, waiting. They weren't random. They were positioned deliberately, like pieces on a board, and then I saw it, the door. Beneath the floor, another black door, its brass handle gleaming through the shifting reflection. I looked back up at the figure in the chair. They were watching me closely now, as if waiting for me to make a choice. The overhead light flickered. The air grew colder. The reflection beneath me deepened, and then the whispering returned. It's almost time. The whispering curled around my thoughts, pulling at something just beneath the surface of memory. It's almost time. I didn't know what that meant, not yet. The figure in the chair remained silent, waiting. The reflection beneath my feet shifted again. The black door below its surface, shimmering like something trapped beneath ice. I hesitated. I could still feel the weight of the figure's stare, steady, expectant. They had spoken as if I had been here before. As if I had done this before. But if that was true, why couldn't I remember? I crouched, reaching a tentative hand toward the shifting floor. The air above it was cold, the surface unnaturally smooth. It didn't ripple at my touch. It remained still, unyielding, refusing to break. "You weren't afraid before," the figure murmured. I looked up. Their expression hadn't changed, but their voice carried something new. An edge of amusement, maybe even familiarity. I stood. "Who are you?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, they gestured toward the shifting floor. "You know what to do." I shook my head. "I don't." The overhead light flickered. The room felt smaller. The air heavier. The whispering grew louder, though I still couldn't make out all of the words. The figure sighed, almost disappointed. "Then I'll remind you." And then they stood. The movement was slow, deliberate, yet immediate. One moment seated, the next standing before me. The chair was gone. The shadows in the room stretched, bending toward them like pulled threads. The whispering stopped. And then the figure reached out, placing their hand on my shoulder. The room collapsed, not into darkness, not into light, into something else entirely. For a brief, impossible moment, I was everywhere at once, moving through doorways I did not remember opening, stepping through places I did not recognize yet had been to before. A hallway of endless doors, a town with no name, a sky stretched too wide, a street where no one walked, a house I had never seen yet had lived in, and then I was back. The room was gone. The shifting floor was gone. The figure was gone. I stood in another place entirely, a train station, empty, silent, forgotten. A clock on the wall read 3:25. A single door stood ahead of me, black wood, brass handle. I exhaled, and then I stepped forward. The train station stretched into silence, vast and empty. The air smelled of dust and rain, though the floor beneath me was dry. Rows of abandoned benches lined the platform, their wooden slats worn smooth by time. The ceiling arched high above, glass panels streaked with dirt, allowing only the faintest traces of light to filter through. There was no train, no distant hum of machinery, no voices, only the black door. It stood at the edge of the platform, separate from the station walls, freestanding as if it had been placed there deliberately. The brass handle gleamed, untouched, waiting. I took a step forward. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud against the tiled floor. The clock on the wall ticked once sharp, deliberate. 3:26. I swallowed. The station should have felt abandoned, but it didn't. Something else was here, watching, waiting. A flicker of movement caught my eye. Not in the shadows, not in the corners of my vision. Out in the open. A figure stood at the far end of the platform, still, silent, dressed in dark clothes that blended into the station's muted tones. Their posture was unnatural, not rigid, not relaxed, but something in between, as though they weren't entirely real. They did not move, but I knew instinctively that if I looked away, they would. I kept walking. The black door grew closer, but the weight of the figure's presence pressed against my back. My pulse quickened. I reached the door. The brass handle was cold this time, the chill seeping into my skin. I hesitated, glancing back over my shoulder. The figure was closer. No sound, no movement, just closer. My breath caught in my throat. I turned the handle. The door swung open. revealing nothing but darkness. Not empty space, not another room, just absence, a void waiting to be entered. The whispering returned, threading through the silence. It's almost 3 o'clock. I glanced back one final time. The figure was gone. I stepped through, and the door closed behind me. The darkness swallowed me whole. Not like stepping into a shadowed room, not like closing my eyes against the night. This was deeper, a space where sound did not exist, where even my own breath felt stolen from me. I tried to move. I wasn't sure if I did. The absence of light stretched endlessly in all directions, yet I felt enclosed, as if walls pressed in on me, unseen but undeniable. A sensation crawled up my spine, a slow, creeping realization. I was not alone. I strained to listen. At first nothing, then something, a heartbeat, not mine. It was slow, rhythmic, deliberate. Each pulse sent a ripple through the space around me, distorting the air like the surface of still water disturbed by a single drop. Then a door, not ahead, not behind, around me. It formed the way a memory does, suddenly present, undeniable, as though it had always been there, waiting for me to notice. White wood, no handle. I reached out. My fingers met the surface, smooth and solid, humming faintly beneath my touch. I pressed against it, but it did not move. The heartbeat quickened, and then I heard them. Whispers not like before. Not disjointed murmurs, not voices woven into the fabric of the air. This was different. This was a conversation. Multiple voices, distinct, urgent. I could not make out the words, but the tone was clear. They were speaking about me. I stepped back. The whispers surged louder, as if reacting to my movement. The door trembled beneath my fingertips. Then, a single phrase emerged from the overlapping voices, spoken so clearly that it cut through the rest like a blade through silk. "You are late." The white door vanished, and suddenly I was somewhere else, a room, small, familiar. A desk, a chair, a lamp casting a dim, golden glow. The air smelled like old paper and dust. A journal lay open before me, filled with handwriting I did not recognize, yet somehow I knew the words were my own. The clock on the wall ticked once, 3:30. The whispering faded, replaced by a deep, resounding silence. And then, just beyond the edges of the dim light, a black door, waiting. The journal lay open before me, its pages worn, the ink slightly smudged, as if someone had closed it before the words had dried. I traced my fingers over the handwriting, my handwriting, yet I had no memory of writing these entries. The words blurred, shifting beneath my gaze, rearranging themselves like thoughts slipping through half-remembered dreams. I was here before, I was here before, I was here before. The sentence repeated down the page, each line pressed into the paper with increasing urgency. My breath caught in my throat. The clock on the wall ticked again, 3:31. I looked toward the black door. It stood just beyond the lamplight's reach, its surface darker than shadow. The brass handle gleamed faintly, as if waiting to be turned. A sound broke the silence, a faint rustling, like fabric shifting in an empty room. My pulse quickened. I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned my head toward the corner where the light did not reach. Something was there. Not moving, not breathing, just watching. A figure, barely more than an outline, standing in the deep shadows. I didn't speak. I couldn't. They took a step forward. The lamplight flickered, stretching their shadow across the floor toward me. Another step. The air turned heavy, pressing down on my chest, my lungs struggling to pull in breath. The figure reached the edge of the light and stopped. I could almost make out their face, but something was wrong. Their features weren't blurred, they weren't obscured, they were unfinished, as if they had never been fully formed. They lifted a hand, pale fingers, too long, curling in a slow, deliberate gesture. Not a threat, not a greeting. Something in between. I swallowed hard. My hand trembled as I reached for the journal again, turning the page. More words, but this time only one sentence. You left the door open. The figure's head tilted, a slow, deliberate motion. The black door behind them creaked, not opening, not closing, just shifting. I took a step back. The air pressed tighter around me. The figure took a step forward and whispered, "You left it open last time, too." The lamp flickered once, and the room collapsed into darkness. The darkness did not swallow me whole this time. It stretched. It shifted. It breathed. I wasn't falling, but I wasn't standing either. I was between. Then a floor. Smooth beneath my feet. A distant ticking sound, slow and deliberate. My lungs ached as if I had been holding my breath for too long. Light flickered to life, dim, unsteady. I was in a hallway, long, endless. Doors on either side, spaced unevenly, some wide open, some barely ajar. Others shut so tightly they seemed a part of the walls themselves. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic, like rust or dried blood. The ticking sound grew louder. I turned my head. At the far end of the hallway stood a grandfather clock. Tall, black, the brass pendulum swinging with slow, deliberate precision. The time read 3:35. And in front of the clock stood a figure, not moving, not breathing, just watching. I knew them, not by name, not by memory, but by presence. I had seen them before, the unfinished face, the two long fingers, the way their head tilted slightly, not with curiosity, but with recognition. I had been here before. The words from the journal came back to me. "You left the door open." I exhaled slowly. The figure did not speak this time. They only waited. I took a step forward. The wooden floor creaked beneath my weight. The moment my foot landed, the nearest doors reacted. One creaked open just an inch. Another slammed shut. A whisper curled through the hallway, too soft to make out, but layered more than one voice, more than one presence. I kept walking. The figure did not move. The ticking grew louder. 3:36. The doors continued their slow, deliberate shifting, as if the hallway itself was alive, deciding what to reveal and what to keep hidden. Then, a sound behind me. Footsteps, soft but not distant, close. I turned my head. The hallway behind me was not empty. Figures stood in the open doorways now, silent, still, unfinished faces peering from the dim light, their forms half shadowed, half real. They were watching. The figure by the clock lifted a hand. The brass pendulum slowed. Tick, tick, tick. And then the clock spoke, not in chimes, not in whispers, in a voice that did not belong to me. "You are running out of time." The hallway shuddered. The doors moved. The figures stepped forward, and the black door appeared behind the clock, waiting. The hallway trembled, not from an earthquake, not from the shifting of walls or the groan of wood, but from something deeper, something unseen. The figures in the doorways stood motionless, yet their presence pressed against me, a silent weight on my chest. Their unfinished faces did not blink, did not breathe. The clock's voice echoed in my head. "You are running out of time." I stepped forward. The pendulum slowed further, its polished brass reflecting the dim light as it swayed with heavy reluctance. The hands of the clock inched forward. 3:37. The black door behind it waited. The figure beside the clock, the one I knew without understanding why, lowered their hand. The moment they did, the hallway exhaled. The doors groaned, the wood straining as though something pressed against them from the other side. A gust of cold air swept through the space, bringing the scent of damp earth and something older, something I had no name for. I kept walking. The figures in the doorways did not move, but I felt them getting closer. Another step. The clock's ticking slowed. Each second stretched, elongated. I reached the figure by the clock, their head tilted. Closer now, I could see more of them. Their form was human, but unfinished features blurred, shifting subtly as though they could never quite settle on what they were meant to be. Their hands, pale and too long, twitched slightly, the only sign of movement. I didn't speak, neither did they. Instead, they stepped aside, and the black door was fully visible. Up close, the wood looked burned, charred at the edges, as if it had survived something catastrophic. The brass handle was warm beneath my fingers. I turned it, The door opened without resistance, and beyond it, another hallway, but this one was different. The walls were lined with clocks, hundreds of them, some tall, some small, some missing hands entirely. Their ticking was chaotic, layered, an orchestra of mismatched time. At the very center of the room stood a single chair, and in it me. I was sitting there, still, expressionless, watching myself as I stepped through the door. I inhaled sharply. The door slammed shut behind me. The version of myself in the chair did not move. But they smiled. I did not move, neither did they. The other me sat perfectly still in the chair, their posture relaxed but unnatural, as if they had been sitting there for a long, long time. The dim, shifting light cast strange shadows across their face, but their expression remained eerily neutral. Except for the smile, it wasn't wide or exaggerated, just a slight curve of the lips, a knowing look. The ticking of the clocks filled the air, overlapping, some faster, some impossibly slow. The smallest ones on the walls twitched erratically, hands spinning in different directions, while the tall grandfather clocks swayed like breathing things. I swallowed hard. "Who are you?" I asked. The other me blinked once, slow and deliberate. The smile did not fade. "I am you," they said. Their voice was my own, but it carried something else beneath it. A layered sound, like an echo that arrived before the words were even spoken. I took a step forward. The clocks reacted. One on my left stopped completely. Another to my right sped up, its hands whirling in a frantic blur. The other me tilted their head slightly, watching. "Sit," they said, motioning toward a second chair that I hadn't noticed before. It stood directly across from them, simple and wooden, as if it had always been there. I hesitated. The walls groaned softly, the weight of time pressing in. I sat. The other me exhaled, as if this was exactly what they had been waiting for. Their smile faded. "You don't remember, do you?" they asked. I shook my head. They nodded, as if that was expected. Then they leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on their knees. "This has happened before," they said. The clocks ticked louder. I felt something cold creep up my spine. The journal's words echoed in my head. "I was here before. I was here before. I was here before. What do you mean?" I whispered. The other me simply gestured toward the walls. The clocks, some were broken, their glass cracked. Others were missing numbers, their faces worn away by something unseen. But as I looked closer, I realized they weren't just clocks, they were records. Each one measured something more than just time. Each one measured me, my choices, my failures, my returns. The other me smiled again. "You always come back," they said. I stared. The clocks shuddered. The air turned heavy. And then, somewhere in the distance, a door creaked open, though I hadn't moved. I couldn't see it yet, but I felt it, the shift in the air, the way the sound of the clocks seemed to bend around the space beyond. The other me sat perfectly still, watching, waiting. Their words lingered, wrapping around my thoughts like a slow, moving fog. "You always come back." The clocks ticked on, some fast, some impossibly slow. I turned my head toward the sound of the open door. It stood just beyond the furthest clock, half, hidden in the dim light. The edges of its frame flickered, as if it wasn't entirely real, or maybe, as if it was struggling to stay that way. I pushed myself to my feet. The other me didn't stop me. They only watched. I hesitated before stepping forward. "What's on the other side?" I asked. The other me finally moved, tilting their head just slightly. "You already know." My breath caught in my throat. The journal's words whispered through my mind again. "You left the door open." I forced myself to take a step. Then another. The wooden floor creaked beneath me, the sound swallowed by the thick air. The closer I got, the more the door seemed to settle, its flickering edges becoming solid. I reached out. The brass handle was ice cold. For a second I hesitated, then I turned it. The moment the door swung open, the clock stopped. Every single one. The silence was unbearable. I stepped through, and I was somewhere else. A corridor, stretching into darkness, the walls lined with mirrors instead of doors. My own reflection watched me from every angle, but none of them moved the way I did. Some were standing still. Some had their backs turned. One directly ahead was walking toward me, not a reflection, a version of myself moving on its own. The moment I realized this, they stopped. Their head lifted slowly, and they smiled. A voice echoed, though their lips didn't move. "You're almost there." A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the mirrors, shaking the floor beneath me. And at the far end of the corridor, another door appeared, not black, not burned, but white, waiting. The white door loomed at the end of the corridor, standing in stark contrast to the endless mirrors that lined the walls. It was smooth, untouched, unmarked by time, completely unlike the blackened, charred door from before. But something about it felt wrong. The reflections in the mirrors were no longer still. They twitched and flickered, shifting as I walked past them. Some turned their heads when I did not. Others took steps I hadn't made. One, a version of myself standing in a mirror to my left, pressed their palm against the glass as I passed. I stopped, so did they, but their hand remained on the surface, as if reaching for something. The humming sound in the corridor deepened. A vibration ran through the floor beneath my feet. I turned my gaze back to the white door at the end of the hall. The reflection did the same, but just before I started walking again, I caught something in the glass. A shadow, not mine, not a reflection, something else standing behind me. I didn't turn, I couldn't. A slow, cold breath brushed the back of my neck, and for the first time, the silence of the corridor was broken by a whisper. Not one voice, many, layered over each other. This is not the first time. My pulse pounded in my ears. I swallowed, forcing myself to take another step forward. The reflection beside me did the same, but their movements were too fluid, too deliberate, like they were walking towards something I wasn't meant to see. The white door was just ahead now, one last step. The whispering stopped. I reached for the handle, and the mirrors shattered. Glass exploded from both sides, 1,000 jagged pieces catching the dim light as they spun through the air. The floor trembled beneath me. The reflection closest to me, myself, did not break like the others. They stepped forward. Out of the frame, into the real world. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The other me stood inches away now, no longer separated by glass. Their eyes, my eyes, were too deep, too dark, as if something else was looking out from behind them, and then they spoke. Their voice was my own, but the words were not. The door only opens at 3. A chime rang out from somewhere unseen. Soft, distant, 3 o'clock. The white door swung open, and the darkness inside swallowed us both, falling not through air, not through space, but through something else. A weightless descent, as if time itself had unspooled beneath me. The darkness wasn't empty, it watched. The other me fell beside me, their face calm, unreadable, no panic, no fear, just that same knowing presence. The chime of 3 o'clock still echoed, stretching impossibly long, as if the moment refused to end. And then the ground caught me, not hard, not sudden, just there. I was standing, my feet resting on something solid. The darkness around me thinned, shapes forming like ink spreading in water. Walls, a ceiling, the dim flicker of light bulbs that shouldn't exist. I was in a room, a waiting room, familiar. The air smelled of dust and something faintly medicinal, like an old hospital or a place meant to be forgotten. Rows of chairs lined the walls, all empty. A reception desk stood ahead, unmanned. The clock on the wall above it ticked steadily, 3 o'clock exactly. No seconds passed, no movement, frozen. I turned. The other me was still there, standing just a few feet away. Their face was unreadable, but this time they weren't alone. Figures sat in the waiting room chairs now. Not shifting, not unfinished like the ones before. These were different, still, watching. Their presence seeped into the air, thick with something I couldn't name. I swallowed. Where are we? The other me finally moved, tilting their head. You already know. The words carried weight. Memories half formed and flickering surfaced in my mind. I had been here before. The receptionist's bell sat on the desk. A small, silver button. Waiting, the air felt thick. I stepped forward, hesitant, my breath slow, measured. The figures in the chairs didn't move, but I could feel their gazes pressing against me. I reached out. Tapped the bell once. Ding. The sound broke the silence like a crack in glass. The figures in the chairs inhaled. All at once, and the room shifted. Not physically, not in a way I could describe, but suddenly, I wasn't just standing there. I was remembering. I had rung this bell before. I had sat in these chairs before. I had waited here before. A door behind the receptionist's desk unlocked with a soft click. I turned to the other me. What's behind that door? Their expression didn't change, but they answered. The end. The clock ticked forward. 3 o'clock became 3:01. The door creaked open, and I stepped through. The door opened soundlessly, revealing a narrow hallway stretching forward into dim, golden light. The walls were smooth, untouched by time, as if nothing had ever passed through before. Yet I knew I had walked this path. Somewhere deep inside me, the memory stirred. The other me did not follow. They remained in the waiting room, standing still, watching. The figures in the chairs remained motionless as well, their breaths slow and measured, as if waiting for something. I hesitated at the threshold, then I stepped through. The door closed behind me. The hallway was silent, except for the soft hum of unseen electricity. The lights overhead flickered in a slow, deliberate rhythm, like breathing. The floor beneath me was cool, smooth, and impossibly clean. I walked forward. The walls were lined with framed photographs. I didn't look at first. I didn't want to. But something in me knew they weren't just random images. They meant something. I turned my head. The first photograph was of a door. Not the blackened door, not the white door, another one, wooden, simple, closed. I walked to the next frame. It was the same door, but slightly open this time, a sliver of darkness visible between the gap. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. The next photograph showed the door open wider, the next, wider still, and the final one, empty. The door was gone. Just an empty frame, as if whatever had been waiting behind it had stepped through. The hum of the lights deepened. I turned away from the photographs and kept walking. At the end of the hall, another door waited. It wasn't black. It wasn't white. It was the same wooden door from the photographs, closed. I reached out. The moment my fingers brushed the handle, a whisper slid through the air. You left the door open. The handle turned on its own, and the door opened. I stepped through. The wooden door swung open without a sound. Beyond it, a room stretched into dimness, the walls lined with bookshelves that reached impossibly high. The scent of aged paper and dust filled the air, thick and heavy, like a library abandoned by time. I stepped inside. The door closed behind me. The silence was different here, thicker. It pressed in, muffling even the sound of my breath. The shelves were filled, but the books were wrong. Their covers bore no titles, no markings, just empty bindings, as if their contents had been stripped away. I reached for one. The moment my fingers brushed the spine, the entire bookshelf shuddered. A whisper curled through the air. You left the door open. I spun around. The room had changed. The bookshelves now stretched in all directions, forming corridors that hadn't been there before. The path I had taken was gone, trapped. I turned back to the book in my hand. It was warm. The cover was blank, but as I opened it, words began to appear written in my own handwriting. A journal entry. I read, I was here before. I have walked these halls, opened these doors, left these pages behind, but I don't remember how it ends. A chill crawled up my spine. The whisper came again, layered and distant. You left the door open. The bookshelves shifted, groaning, their wooden frames bending inward. The corridors changed shape, leading somewhere else now. A single book fell from a shelf ahead. I approached it. The cover wasn't blank. It had a title, my name, my real name. I reached down, but before I could pick it up, a gust of air rushed through the room. The shelves collapsed inward, and the floor vanished beneath me. I was falling again, but this time I wasn't alone. The books were falling with me, their empty pages fluttering, scattering into the void like torn fragments of a forgotten story. The book with my name tumbled just out of reach, spinning endlessly, slipping further away no matter how hard I reached for it. The air around me was thick, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. The whispering returned not one voice, but many. They wove through the darkness, threading words into my thoughts. You left the door open. The meaning was different this time. Not a warning, a memory. I had left it open, not just once, but over and over, a cycle, a return. This wasn't the first time I had walked these halls, touched these doors, followed these shifting paths. The dream had remembered me, and it had been waiting. The fall slowed, or maybe the world was rising to meet me. I landed on my feet, the impact soundless. The floor beneath me was smooth, stretching in all directions into misty twilight. A table stood ahead, carved from dark wood, empty except for a single object resting in its center. A mask not like the others. This one was cracked, its surface worn smooth by time, and I knew somehow that it belonged to me. The whispering voices hushed, waiting. I stepped forward, heart pounding, the weight of unseen memories pressing in. The air tasted electric, charged with something I couldn't name. I reached out. My fingers brushed the mask. And the world shifted. The mist pulled back. A door appeared ahead, not black, not white, not wooden, but something older, something final. The last door stood open, waiting. A deep stillness filled the space beyond, a silence too heavy, too aware. The mask in my hands was warm, as if it had been held before. By me, by someone else, by something that had walked this path too many times to count. I stepped forward. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world tilted, not in motion, in understanding. I had been here before. The memory didn't return all at once. It came in fragments, like light filtering through shifting clouds. I saw myself walking these halls, opening these doors, waking, returning, forgetting. A cycle, a pattern. A trap. The door closed behind me without a sound. The space beyond was vast, stretching in all directions without end. A floor existed beneath my feet, but there were no walls, no ceiling, only an endless horizon of shifting shadows and dim, golden light. And in the center of it all, a figure stood, waiting, not my reflection, not a stranger, me. Not the other me I had seen before, not the mirror image stepping out of glass, or the silent presence watching from the waiting room. This was the version that remembered. Their gaze was steady, unreadable, their hands empty, no mask. No book, no door behind them, just me. A whisper brushed against my thoughts, familiar and distant. You left the door open. And then, for the first time, the other me spoke. Their voice was my own. Are you ready to remember? The final door began to close. The final door was closing, not fast, not slow, just inevitable. The other me, the version that remembered, stood between me and the fading light beyond. Their expression was calm, waiting, as if they already knew what I would choose. Are you ready to remember? The question lingered in the air, heavier than the silence around us. I wanted to say yes, but something inside me hesitated, because remembering meant understanding, and understanding meant there would be no way back. The mask in my hands was warm, almost pulsing. It had been mine before. I knew that now. I had worn it, taken it off, left it behind. And every time I had walked through the doors, searching, forgetting, beginning again, the whisper returned. You left the door open. Not a warning, not a threat, a reminder. The cycle wasn't forced upon me. I had created it. The shifting rooms, the endless doors, the waiting figures, they weren't traps. They were choices. I had walked this path again and again, running from something I no longer remembered. But now I stood at the final threshold. And I had to decide. The other me stepped aside, revealing something behind them. A chair, simple, wooden. The kind you'd find in an old waiting room. I knew what it meant. If I sat, the cycle would begin again. The doors would return. The forgetting would take hold. and I would find myself waking once more, drawn to the mystery of a door that only opened at 3 o'clock. But if I walked forward, if I stepped past the other me, through the final door before it shut, I would remember. Everything, the hum of unseen electricity buzzed in my ears. The air was thick with expectation. The door groaned softly as it continued to close. The other me watched, waiting. This was the last moment, the last choice. I took a breath deep, steady. And then I stepped forward, past the chair, past the other me, into the final door and out of the dream.